Does the federal government have the power to infringe on our First Amendment rights during times of war? And if not, does its violation of our rights justify the states in breaking away from the country or in nullifying federal law? These are the questions that were hotly debated in the late 1790s in the United States with the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts under the presidency of John Adams. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which were actually a series of 4 acts, are known as the greatest stain in the presidency of John Adams. And the 5th Congress, who passed these laws, has gone down in infamy. In fact, things got so bad that one of America's most prominent founding fathers actually proposed that states do not follow these laws and that they should break away from the Union. And as some of you may know, this principle actually was instrumental in the breaking of the country during the Civil War. Today we're going to take a deeper look at these 4 laws, their causes and effects, and just their long-term impact in how we practice our freedom of speech today. Many history textbooks explain that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 acts that Congress passed in 1798. They wanted to combat and prevent the opposing party, the Democratic-Republican Party, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, or Republicans for short, from criticizing the federal government. These laws made the process of citizenship for foreigners an extremely long and difficult process. In addition, these acts led to the arrest of many Americans who expressed their opposition towards the federal government. But how did it come to be that such laws would even be passed in our country, especially so soon after the First Amendment had been written and ratified by the country? Let's go ahead and take a closer look at the context and the causes around this event. John Adams always described the Alien and Sedition Acts as war measures. Remember, we were in an unofficial, undeclared war with France at this time. The Federalists in Congress, even moderates, had a lot of fears about the French and the French government. The French people had overthrown and beheaded their king, and in just a short amount of time, they had taken over much of Europe. For example, they invaded and took over Belgium and parts of Germany. More disturbing, the French used pro-French citizens of the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Italy as spies to turn those countries into puppet governments that would be subordinate to France. So the Federalists in the United States, especially in Congress, wondered, couldn't the United States be next? After all, in June 13, 1798, a dedicated Republican politician from Philadelphia named Dr. George Logan went on his own accord to France by a roundabout way to meet with the French government and welcome the French army into the United States so that they could teach us the genuine value of true and essential liberty. By the way, when I say Republican, I'm not talking about the Republican Party of today. The Republican Party of today traced their roots back to Abraham Lincoln, and the Republicans that I'm talking about in the 1790s are the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans. And in fact, the Democrats of today are the ones who can trace their roots all the way back to this time and to this party. Just had to get that out of the way. In addition, Federalists wondered how a Republican newspaper was able to publish a private letter that the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand had written to the State Department, even before the government released the letter to the American public. In their minds, this was strong evidence that France had a direct line to its spies in the United States and that most of these spies were probably newspaper editors. Speaking of newspaper editors, many of them were immigrants and were Democratic Republicans who criticized George Washington's presidency and now John Adams' presidency. Federalists believed that they were there and eager to disturb the peace of the American Republic. In 1790s, nearly 100,000 immigrants came to live in the United States. Americans accepted the idea that the United States was a refuge for persecuted people all around the world. In 1795, Federalists and Republicans worked together to pass the Naturalization Act. It stated that in order to become a naturalized citizen of the United States, you had to have lived in the United States for at least 5 years. Applicants also had to give up any noble titles or rights that they had from their previous countries. They had to prove good moral character and a devotion to the Constitution. And so, even though it was the Federalists who encouraged immigration into the United States in the early 1790s so that they could sell land, by the late 1790s, they were actually very worried about the influx of immigrants. They were also worried because Americans could renounce their citizenship, leave, and then come back and apply for citizenship again. This just seemed really abusive of the privileges of the citizenship and something that could easily be taken advantage of. In addition to immigrants, the other major thing that Federalists were worried about were newspapers. The number of newspapers in the 1790s more than doubled. America was quickly becoming the largest newspaper reading population in the world. And in addition to that, the early newspapers were very pro-Federalist, or they tended to support the government and the party in charge. But now, there were many new newspapers that were starting to openly criticize the government. The press was transforming from becoming a platform for neutral advertising, merchant information, and foreign news into actual party activists. For example, the Gazette of the United States, which was edited by John Fino, was extremely Federalist and published articles that always supported the federal government and criticized the opposing party. On the other side, Philip Freneau's The National Gazette was Democratic-Republican, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison even had a hand in helping it start. They published many articles that denounced policies of Alexander Hamilton and other Federalist policies. The fact that many editors are actually immigrants from other countries, mostly political refugees, actually also really worried the Federalists. They tended to come from Britain or Ireland and were very active politically. They were writers, printers, and editors. And yes, immigrants did have disproportionate representation among newspaper editors in the United States. According to historian Gordon Wood, in several decades following the end of the Revolutionary War, 23 English, Scottish, and Irish radicals edited and produced no fewer than 57 American newspapers and magazines, most of which supported the Republican cause in the politically sensitive Middle States. Since the early 1790s, over 90% of newspapers had generally supported the Federalists. This surge of Republican papers represented a shift in a short period of time. And at this time, there were no such thing as party lists or official ballots, and so newspaper subscriptions and readerships created that sense of community and solidarity among people with like opinions and similar political goals. Newspapers really helped to build party identity. They helped to really mobilize the people and get them into politics. They were able to convince their readers that the readers' own personal interests aligned with party objectives and that they should join in on the cause to achieve a political purpose. Political parties had no real effective way to do this en masse outside of newspapers. So in Federalists' minds, not only were there already citizens who were democratic Republicans and friendly to the French cause, but there were also French foreigners, French immigrants in the United States. And in addition to that, there were a large number of wild Irish immigrating into the United States. And these Irish, because of their conflict with the British government, were very pro-French and passionately so. And so they tended to be Democratic Republicans. And so, in order to better control immigration and the newspapers, the Federalists in Congress were successful in very narrowly passing the 4 acts that would be known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And before we dive into these 4 acts, it is worth noting that even though the Alien and Sedition Acts are synonymous with the name of President John Adams, he actually said that that was never something he recommended to Congress at that time. And historians Stanley Elkins and Eric McKittrick say that there's actually no evidence that that was a major part or even any part of John Adams's program as president to criminalize sedition at all. He tended to lean more towards cooperation rather than forcing people to do things that he wanted them to do. The first law that was passed was the Naturalization Act of June 18, 1798. It made the citizenship process for foreigners longer and more difficult. Now immigrants had to be U.S. residents for 14 years instead of just 5 years. Upon arriving in the United States, all immigrants had to register with the government within 48 hours. And immigrants who were citizens of a country that the United States was at war with were not qualified to become citizens at all. The second of the 4 acts was the Alien Friends Act of June 25th, 1798. It was an act that dealt with foreigners during peacetime as well as wartime. And we get a little insight into the minds of Federalists when they wrote this bill from one of Abigail Adams's letters. In it, she states that we must keep watch over foreigners during tense times like these. He's talking about the Quasi-war with France. Technically, it was peacetime in the United States because the conflict that we were having with France was undeclared and unofficial, even though they were attacking American ships at sea and we were having a trade war. So the original Senate bill of the Alien Friends Act was actually much worse than the actual bill that was passed. It intended to get rid of as many immigrants as possible, especially the Irish, through mass deportation and just isolating them from the rest of the population. The original draft required foreigners to register themselves and to apply for permits in order to stay in the country. They had to show proof of good behavior. They also had to limit their travels within the country and stay under surveillance by the government. No one could harbor, entertain, or conceal a foreigner without first having written a permission to a judge several days in advance. Thankfully, a lot of these measures were struck down by other Federalists in Congress. Even Alexander Hamilton, who was the leader of the extreme branch of the Federalist Party, thought that his friends in Congress had gone a little bit crazy. So, though it was much better than the original draft, the final bill still contained a lot of unbelievable measures that many people opposed. First, it gave the president power to kick out any foreigner that he saw as dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. He didn't have to give reason, and that foreigner wasn't entitled to a trial. If the person failed to leave, the punishment would be up to 3 years in prison and permanent loss of the ability to become a citizen of the United States. So, of course, Republicans strongly opposed the Alien Friends and Naturalization Acts. First, they denied the likelihood that France would invade the United States. They also claimed that state courts and state laws were more than capable of handling any person that presented a danger to the peace. Republicans called upon Article 5 of the Constitution to condemn the Alien Friends Act as unconstitutional. Though interestingly, Article 5 actually had something to do with slavery and the slave trade. It prohibited the federal government from stopping the migration and importation of people into the United States until after 1808. In addition, Republicans pointed out that the Alien Friends Act violated the Fifth Amendment guarantee that no person should be deprived of their life, liberty, and property without due process of law. This applied to every person, not just citizens. Finally, critics condemned the Alien and Sedition Act as giving the president too much power to use against whomever he wanted. It's interesting though, because in the end, Adams himself wanted the strictest interpretation of this law and never used the power that it gave him to deport anyone. Not a single foreigner was deported before the act expired in 1800, even though, of course, many of them left voluntarily out of fear. So in contrast with the Alien Friends Act, the third of the acts, the Alien Enemies Act of July 6, 1798, actually would not have passed without the help of Republicans, and it is still in effect today. By the time the final draft of the bill had been completed, the major edits had made it more of a Republican measure rather than a Federalist measure. So initially, it was actually the Republican Party, the Democratic-Republican Party, who were very concerned or cautious about immigrants in the country. They felt that immigrants coming from monarchical countries would come into the United States and dilute or corrupt the ideals of the American Republic. So they had always wanted to limit immigration, even before the Federalists had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Alien Enemies Act basically restricted foreigners from enemy countries. It gave the federal government power to relocate, deport, arrest, and imprison any adult male, any male over 14 years of age that was coming from an enemy country. Again, this act is still in force today and has been used against immigrants in this country during both World War I and World War II, and most memorably by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt against Japanese immigrants, as well as Japanese American citizens during World War II. Finally, the last of the four acts to be passed was also the most notorious, and that is the Sedition Act of July 14, 1798. This act made it a crime to say or publish any false or scandalous writing or writings against the government of the United States, particularly the President and Congress, with the intent to defame or bring them to contempt or disrepute. This meant that they would be punished for saying anything that implied that the government was going against the Constitution or violating the rights of the people, which is what they were doing in the first place. So it all sounds so crazy to us now and to many people back then, yes, but this final bill of the Sedition Act was actually very light compared to what the Federalists originally had in mind. The original bill included punishments just for threats, for threatening to defame the federal government. It also included a section on treason during peacetime. Though there was no official war, again, France was considered an enemy. So the original bill had that any person caught aiding the enemy, France, would be punished with death. Even just expressing support for the French government was actually punishable by law, according to this original draft. But the majority of Federalists in the Senate actually saw that this was unreasonable, and they struck down treason and any mention of France from the original bill. So when the Senate passed the bill onto the House for their approval, it actually contained just a lot of the traditional common law practices that were in force at the time regarding sedition. By the way, common law is that body of law that's been established from decisions judges have made in past cases. The United States uses common law. For example, the Supreme Court, before they pass down their decision, they actually examine any cases that might be similar to the one that they're currently hearing. And usually, they tend to stick very close to the decisions that previous courts or previous judges have already made, unless they're deciding to overturn a previous case or previous judgment. Now, traditional common law on sedition in 1798 in the United States followed the tradition of English courts. According to English common law at the time, it was actually a crime to publish or say anything that criticized or even just intended to criticize the government. People could be punished for saying or writing things that made other people feel any sort of dissatisfaction or suspicion towards their government. Finally, usually we say it's okay to publish if it's true, right? It's not bad if I'm just publishing the truth. Well, in English common law, there's actually a saying that the greater the truth, the greater the libel. So the truth couldn't be used as defense for the crime. It actually made you more guilty. So anyway, the Senate bill was still too crazy in the eyes of the Federalists in the House. So they cut out more things so that the final bill that would eventually be the Sedition Act was actually a liberalization of common law. Like, it was much lighter than traditional laws on sedition. First, it said that malicious intent had to be proved. And contrary to common law, evidence of the truth could be admitted as a defense for libel. Criticisms of judges was eliminated from the bill so that it was just the president and Congress that people couldn't criticize publicly. And finally, a jury of peers got to decide whether a person was guilty or not guilty, which again is different from common law at the time when the verdict of guilty or not guilty was in the hands of one judge. Still, with all this, the Sedition Act passed by just a very narrow margin of 44 to 41. So as a result, these four acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts, destroyed whatever unity that was in the country that had resulted from the XYZ affair. In addition, it contributed greatly to the loss of President John Adams in his bid for re-election as president in the election of 1800. Many editors were arrested as a result of these laws, and many more left the country. Some prominent cases included Congressman Matthew Lyon from Vermont, Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was the editor of the Democratic-Republican newspaper, the Aurora, and finally, a Federalist justice of the peace from Otsego, New York, named Jedediah Peck. He opposed the acts, and he was indicted for libel. He was transported in chains to Albany, and there was great public outrage, and he became the suffering martyr of freedom of speech. So of the 25 well-known Democratic Republicans, 11 of them were put to trial, and all of them, except for one, were convicted and faced jail time. The Alien and Sedition Acts were so atrocious that they actually convinced James Madison to get back into political action. He had retired from public life after his terms in Congress, but now he was motivated to speak out against these unfair violations of our rights under the Constitution. But he did it anonymously. He was joined by Vice President Thomas Jefferson, and together they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, with James Madison writing the Virginia resolution and Thomas Jefferson writing something that the Kentucky legislature eventually adopted. So these resolutions were actually political statements that the state legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky adopted and published, and they took a firm stance against the Alien and Sedition Acts as a governing body of their own states. Thomas Jefferson in particular had a very strong reaction. He advocated for nullification or cancellation of these laws and secession, breaking away from the Union. He stated that nullification and secession were the only solution when the federal government was committing such a grave violation of the people's rights under the Constitution. Here are just a few excerpts from his draft of the Kentucky resolution. Resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Resolved, that it is true as a general principle and is also expressly declared by one of the amendments to the Constitution that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people, and that no power over the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, or freedom of the press being delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, all lawful powers respecting the same did of right remain and were reserved. So he's basically emphasizing social contract between the states and between the states and the federal government. The states agreed to be part of the Union so long as the federal government respected the rights that were given in the Constitution. In addition, he's saying that the federal governments have specific powers that the Constitution gave it, and any power that wasn't specifically given to it by the Constitution actually belonged to the states and the people. And the Alien and Sedition Acts directly violated this. He also reminded readers that the United States federal government was just a creature of this social compact and this contract between the states. It wasn't a party in this contract. It was created by this agreement between the states. The states came first, and the federal government had a duty to respect and protect the authority of the states. He talks about what should happen if the federal government violates the states' rights under the Constitution. Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits, that without this right, they would be under the dominion absolute and unlimited of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. That nevertheless this Commonwealth, from motives of regard and respect for its co-states, has wished to communicate with them on the subject, that with them alone it is proper to communicate, they alone being parties to the compact and solely authorized to judge in the last resort of the powers exercised under it, Congress being not a party, but merely the creature of the compact, and subject as to its assumptions of power to the final judgment of those by whom and for whose use itself and its powers were all created and modified, that if the acts before specified should stand, these conclusions would flow from them. So you can see those are very strong words in support of nullification and secession and the sovereignty of states. These are the very same principles that the southern states used in order to secede from the unions only about 60 years later, and it directly resulted in the Civil War. So James Madison felt that Thomas Jefferson's draft was actually too strong, and he wanted to actually appeal to the Union, to the supporters of the Union. He stated that it was the people's duty to protest any violation of rights that was under the Constitution, which is what kept them all united and staying together. He was much more specific and limited his attacks to just the Alien and Sedition Acts. He was also more broad and more vague about possible solutions to the problem. He avoided talk of nullification and secession because he wanted to get as many supporters as possible. And the final drafts of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions actually weren't as strongly worded as Thomas Jefferson's original draft, but still they remained, and the southern states referred back to them to justify their secession. So there's a lot to think about with these Alien and Sedition Acts. Here are just a few questions that I'd like us to begin reflecting upon. So first, do you think we should still have the Alien Enemies Act? It is still in effect. And in light of all the things that have happened in our country, most especially 9/11, should we continue to have it? Right? I mean, I understand we have to weigh the risk of potentially having really dangerous foreign entities in our country that could be planning attacks, and versus being fair and treating people with their dignity and rights, right? In addition, I could also see the argument for, well, we have regular American citizens who are just as dangerous, if not more, potentially, right? So I think that's something that can still be discussed. And I know recently, maybe a couple of years ago, Senator Hirono, I believe, introduced a bill to overturn or to replace the Alien Enemies Act. So I know that's something that people are thinking about, and especially knowing what it led to during World War II is really an atrocious thing, right? Sometimes people just use this to get carried away and to commit a lot of injustices. The second thing is, in light of new technological advances in social media, how should free speech be treated by the government today? Should there be a difference between false information and true information, the way that these two are treated? And if so, who gets to decide what information is false and what information is true, or maybe just information from a different perspective? I'm also thinking especially about the quick and massive spread of riots and violence after the events in Minneapolis in the aftermath of the George Floyd incident, as well as the events of January 6th. What role did media, both social media and mainstream media, play in these events, in giving a platform to speech that some would consider speech that created a clear and present danger? Were any of the statements made and published considered seditious? And if so, who gets to decide if they were seditious? It's also interesting to see the different results and the different criminal charges that resulted from these two events. Third, do you agree with Thomas Jefferson's proposal that states should be able to nullify laws that the federal government passed that violate people's rights under the Constitution? In the past, that answer may have seemed obvious, but in light of the pandemic, COVID-19 mandates, it might be something that people have been thinking about recently. And considering how the federal government seems to be following in the footsteps of Alexander Hamilton and how he interpreted the Constitution's necessary and proper clause, I think there's actually a lot that the federal government believes it can do. And recently, it's really been up to the state governments to really resist and put up a fight to make sure that the federal government does not commit things that other people consider as an overreach. But again, we're a rich, very diverse country, and we all have different opinions on this. And it is very healthy to have debate and discussions about these things. Finally, going back to the history perspective, I want to ask you this last question. Which do you think was more harmful for the country? The Federalists' restriction on citizenship and free speech, or Thomas Jefferson's proposals for nullification and secession? And we know the long-term consequences of each. Thankfully, today, I don't think that is a question we really have to grapple with, and I hope it's not something that we'll have to really consider in the near future, but you never know, and that's why these things are important to think about and know. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.